All right, this is where we left off. So, who is Andrew Jackson? He is as we talked a little bit about earlier in the lesson, comes from nothing. He's our first president born out in Appalachia on the border of North Carolina, South Carolina. He was a self-made man. He was a barroom brawler. He was self-taught in politics, a war hero, a national celebrity as a result of the Battle of New Orleans and the War of 1812, not to mention his fighting against Seminole and other Native American tribes like the Lower Creek, Battle of Horseshoe Bend. The thing that propels Jackson to political success is that the common man no longer has to have what to vote? Land. Very good. No longer do you have to own land. So this expands voting rights, or what we would call suffrage, or the franchise, the opportunity to vote. Jackson is going to put a lot of his supporters in political office. So when he gets elected, this becomes known as the spoils system. To the victor go the spoils of war. He puts friends, supporters in these positions, and that doesn't always work out best for Jackson. A very interesting event would be his inauguration. The first inauguration was known as the inaugural brawl because people were racing horses around the executive mansion, drinking hard cider, drinking whiskey, partying hard, having a good time. And the King Mob, as they started to call Jackson, when he arrived at the executive mansion, people ran in, destroyed White House china, started ripping the curtains down. They had to coax the people out of the executive mansion with more alcohol on the executive lawn. So, or what we would consider the White House lawn. Remember, he was famous for pistol dueling. Low number of confirmed duels would be like 13. Some estimate as many as 80 or 90 duels. Had 2 bullets lodged in his chest as a result of the duels. So at this period of time, he is most certainly what would be considered the president for the common man. I got a couple of political cartoons here that relate to the Jacksonian era. We've got some really solid political cartoons related to this era and the era of the new nation. So here we have Jackson on a pig, sort of like as a war hero, but not really, because the statue is not him on horseback and commemorating any victory in war. It's commemorating the spoils system, and the pig is a symbol of the greed that the spoils system has created and the corruption. Probably the best example of the corruption in the spoils system would be over here with the meeting of Swartwout and Price in London. Samuel Swartwout, who we've talked about before, had been a longtime friend of Aaron Burr, he got the job as collector of the Port of New York. This is a really profitable job. This is a job that you need to give to a guy that you can trust, not a guy that's going to embezzle over $1 million. I'm not talking about $1 million in today's money. I'm talking about $1 million in the 1820s. And this guy's going to flee to England. He'll actually end up helping Aaron Burr when Burr flees to England as well. The Tariff of Abominations. This is one of the earliest events in the presidency that creates quite a bit of turmoil. It actually almost creates a near civil war, or at least the secession of South Carolina. I'm going to try and explain this sort of in a nutshell so it's not too confusing. The Jacksonians are going to raise the tariff from 23% to 37%. Now remember, Southerners hate the tariff, notably Southern plantation owners or Southerners who grow cash crops like cotton, tobacco, corn, indigo, rice, anything that makes a lot of money in international trade, because they want to move their goods to market quickly. Whereas in the North, or in the Midwest, or or parts of the East, the industrial economy and the industrial business owners, they love the tariff because the tariff protects them from competition. So if you really want to look at an early cause of the American Civil War, we have to look at tariffs. And this is not an opportunity to say, oh, well, the Civil War had so much to do with tariffs, as much to do with tariffs as it did slavery. Don't be fooled. The issue of tariffs and the issue of slavery is intertwined, okay? It's brought together. So, in this particular tariff, it ultimately leads John C. Calhoun over another issue known as the Petticoat Affairs, and this issue of the tariff. He's ultimately going to resign from office. He goes back to South Carolina. He leads the charge on this. Jackson's not going to be intimidated by the state of South Carolina saying that they would secede or nullify this tariff. In fact, he threatens to come down with an army and hang John C. Calhoun from a tree. John C. Calhoun knows that he'll actually do this. So this is a very bizarre standoff. This is also a dismantling of the trust in a lot of Jackson's administration. He starts to lose faith in a lot of his cabinet members. Cabinet members start resigning, or he starts removing cabinet members. The majority of his most trusted advisors are known as the kitchen cabinet. There's a group of guys that snuck through the back kitchen door that were just a bunch of his buddies who provided him advice. I mean, they were political and militarily connected. So this particular issue is going to obviously pit John C. Calhoun and Jackson against one another. And remember, Jackson and Calhoun and Jackson and Clay are fierce political rivals. He considers them his two greatest political rivals. So a little bit about this. Do keep in mind that the state of South Carolina attempting to secede means they would break away. They might potentially try to become their own country or form their own country. We're obviously going to see that occur in 1860 when they break away, and South Carolina and other states will form the Confederate States in 1861. The guy that steps in to prevent civil war here is going to be none other than Henry Clay. Jackson's, one of his political opponents, steps in to stop this crisis. This is another reason why we call Henry Clay the Great Compromiser. He brokered the Missouri Compromise. He brokered the nullification crisis. He brokered the compromise in 1850. So a new tariff was passed through Congress. It's going to lower the tariff, but Jackson wants something in return. And what he's going to get is an amendment to Article 2 of the Constitution, and that's for the ability of the president to raise an army if a state threatens to secede or nullifies a law. So Jackson never uses the force bill. Who does? Who uses the force bill? Who raises an army to stop rebelling states? Any ideas? Awesome. Nice job, guys. Abraham Lincoln. So the reason that I find it important to bring this up, this is the interesting trajectory that we're on toward the Civil War, and I want to point that out. Obviously, we've talked about the Trail of Tears. This is the result of the Indian Removal Act. It does not only impact the Cherokee, Sauk, Fox, Kickapoo, Black Hawk, Seminole. These are all tribes that are involved in the Indian Removal Act. Why are they losing their ancestral land? Yeah.
Because we're moving west.
Yes. They're moving west. They want the land for settlement. They want the land for resources, right? What do we know about the Cherokee? Where did they go to fight this? Well, we know that there was a time when the Cherokee took up the hatchet and went to battle. Well, what do we talk about in the last part of the lesson, where did the Cherokee go at this point in time to keep their land? And they won. But the decision was ignored. Supreme Court. Good job. Who said that? Nice work. The Supreme Court. So keep in mind that these native groups are going to be pushed out, but they're going to be pushed out really at gunpoint. All right? They're marched out at gunpoint at the order of Andrew Jackson. Here are some of the tribes that were impacted, the 5 civilized tribes as they were known: the Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Seminole. The Seminole actually fought in the Second Seminole War to try to hold their ground and hold their reservation. This particular Second Seminole War was led by Osceola. Remember, Jackson had led the First Seminole War, and where these native people are going to be removed to is present-day Oklahoma and Kansas. At this period of time, it was just called Indian Territory. It's not Oklahoma yet. So here is a painting on the left of the movement of the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears, and on the right, that is Seminole Chief Osceola, leader of the Second Seminole War. Let's talk a little bit about the Bank War. Andrew Jackson saw the Bank of the United States. Remember the national banking system created by Andrew Jackson. He saw that, and by this time, Hamilton's long gone, but the bank's still around. He sees it as a direct threat to the common man. That the Bank of the United States is stealing from the common man, and it's only allowing the rich to get richer. The irony of all this is the fact that the Bank of the United States is providing stability, economic stability, not just for the common man, but also for the region that's railing against it the most, and that's the American West. A lot of the wildcat banks, these like private banks that were cranking out a bunch of money, that wanted high inflationary tactics, they didn't have the specie, the gold and silver, to back their dollar. The Bank of the United States, the national banking system, they were actually minting gold and silver, and that minted currency, it was backed by the physical currency. There was a legit standard there. So when this bank is defended, it's defended by this guy, Nicholas Biddle. But the problem is, Biddle is insanely corrupt. And Biddle's also supported by Jackson's political rival and soon-to-be presidential opponent, Henry Clay. So Jackson makes it his mission to not only destroy the bank, but to use the power of the veto on the recharter. So when the bank is rechartered, and John Marshall and the Supreme Court ruled that the rechartering of the bank is constitutional, Jackson uses the veto to destroy the bank. And this is what really the whole election of 1832 kind of comes down to: the survival or the death of the bank. Another layer of irony here: the death of the bank causes and creates larger problems in the West, larger problems in the South, and it creates bigger problems for the common man than it would have otherwise, because it's going to create a crippling economic panic that we're going to talk about here momentarily. So on the left, we got Nicholas Biddle, another really great political cartoon from the era. This is Henry Clay trying to sew Jackson's mouth shut over the bank, recharter of the bank. Here's another political cartoon of Jackson using the veto to try to kill the many-headed monster that was the Bank of the United States. His Vice President, Martin Van Buren, there, helping hold the monster. Military captain. So Jackson will defeat Clay in the election of 1832. It's yet another mudslinging campaign, just like we saw in 24 and in 28. This is another interesting era. This is what we would call the emergence of the third party movements. Clay runs as a National Republican candidate. This is a really quick flash in the pan type of party. They will evolve into what will become the Whig Party. There's another third party movement called the Anti-Freemason Party. They ran a candidate named William Wirt. There were a bunch of Freemasons who decided to defect from the fraternal organization and threatened to reveal the secrets of the fraternal organization. A lot of people in politics at this time and even today are tied to the Masonic order of Freemasons. And the mysterious disappearance of a member of the Anti-Freemasons and a guy that had threatened to reveal the secrets, William Morgan, helped promote this party. But this party is really, it falls apart not long after this particular election. So this is an election with 4 major candidates. We've got Andrew Jackson, who wins the election, Henry Clay from the West, the national, sort of, as he sees himself, the national Republican, John Floyd of Virginia, and William Wirt, who was the anti-Freemason or anti-Masonic candidate. So the bank falls apart. This actually creates a really sharp panic early on, because now the currency in the wildcat banks in the West the values are falling out of the bottom. The money gets redistributed to the states, but within a few short years, the printing and printing and printing of all the money and the lack of gold and silver that any of these banks hang on to creates a high level of what? Inflation. Very good. Which then leads to doing what to goods? Very good. Lowers their value. Depreciation, and then what can get really scary is a thing called deflation, right? So when that starts to happen, and you've got high levels of inflation, depreciation of the value of goods, people foreclosing on loans, bank failures, a rate of unemployment that rises to about 10%. Those are all the ingredients for the recipe of a what? A depression. Very good. So what this leads to is an economic depression known as the Panic of 1837. So that's going to be an important thing from your review. You guys might want to pull your reviews out, if you haven't already, and take a look. The Panic of 1837 was one of the earliest and a very problematic economic depression. At this period of time, what you need to understand is the federal government did not feel like it was their responsibility, nor did states really think it was their responsibility to help bail out anyone or any entity or any private organization out of a depressionary crisis. So this is the sort of idea of King Andrew. This shows Andrew Jackson stomping on the Constitution and using the old hickory scepter, the hickory stick, and the power of the veto to kill the bank. This leads to the rise of the Whigs. So the election of 1836 brings about his successor and vice president, Martin Van Buren. It's kind of surprising he decides not to run for a third term. It's kind of wild. He was getting up there in age. But the Whig Party, the newly found party, did something that was not all that advantageous, and that was they ran multiple candidates. They were looking for regional candidates. This is one of those elections where you have 5 major candidates running in the election. That's going to divide up not only the popular vote, but what other vote? Very good. You guys are doing great today. Keep it up. What's up?
So at that time, we could go for 1 or 2 terms.
Yeah,
So
correct. In fact, we have one guy who was elected to 4. Franklin D. Roosevelt. He served 3, didn't serve as 4th because he died not shortly thereafter he was elected. So Van Buren comes in dealing with the destruction of the bank and what becomes known as the Panic of 1837. The Panic of 1837 rules Van Buren's presidency, completely owns his presidency. He has to deal with this crazy rate of inflation. So you just see this is quite a few candidates, right? Van Buren wins. He wins really, in essence, by a landslide. He's gotten over the 50% he needs not to have to go to, not to have to take it to the House. But check this out. Let's say you take Hugh Lawson White out and Willie Person Mangum, and you just run Webster or run William Henry Harrison, be a whole lot closer, right? This thing might be going to the House of Representatives. So the Whig Party learns a valuable lesson here. They're going to have to pick a candidate, and they're going to have to pick a candidate that appeals to what group? I think somebody said it. Somebody say everybody? Nobody? Everybody. They got to find a candidate that appeals to the common man. They got to find an Andrew Jackson type, and that's something they didn't feel like they had in Henry Clay, which is crazy. The guy essentially founded the party. Same deal with Daniel Webster. They didn't feel like they had that in a candidate, Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster was a founder of the party. So it's very interesting who they don't run during this era that were like the political heavyweights for their party. So, the new party movements, obviously, rise in interest group politics, changing style of campaigning, like one place you might need to bring Bibles, and the next place you might need to bring whiskey and hard cider. It all depends on who you're appealing to. Increased voting participation, personifying sort of this era of Jacksonian democratic spirit, the voting of the common man. The Federalist Party's gone, so this opens up the door for a new party movement. And that's why we're going to see these new parties come about. So, let's take a look at the Whigs. The Whigs are looking for a national platform, kind of jumping off of what Henry Clay had preached about the American system, renewal of the national bank, protective tariffs to protect American industry, internal improvements, bridges, roads, canals. We're not far now from railroads. Railroad production is going to be big. Public schools. Moral reform, though, that's going to create a division in the Whig Party. What do I mean by moral reform? Like what? What kind of moral reform are we looking at in this era? Any ideas? Yeah. Yeah, bringing about an end to slavery, right? Women's rights. Children's labor rights. Okay? But the slavery issue, well put, is the main issue. That leads to the splintering of the Whig Party. This is what would become known as the conscious Whigs, the Whigs that want abolition, and the cotton Whigs, the Whigs that are tied to the slave trade, tied to slave labor, tied to the plantation system, tied to the production of cotton. Henry Clay becomes a national figure for the Whigs, as does Daniel Webster during this era. This is a really great broadside, this primary document. It says, "Great Whig meeting, a mass meeting, Whigs to the rally." This particular Whig rally is actually to remove one of their most prominent candidates, and that is John Tyler. I don't know if you all realize that John Tyler was never elected president. You guys know that? He became president because William Henry Harrison died in office. Tyler ran as a Whig, but his policies were Democratic. So when he got into office, he didn't follow through with any Whig policies. Therefore, they actually removed him from the party. And they did not have him run again as a Whig candidate. There's another group that I want to highlight, and that's the nativists. They're known as the Know-Nothing Party. They met in secrecy a lot. They were typically, like if they were approached, they would say, hey, you know, what's your platform? I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know nothing about that. Their platform was they were anti-immigrant. They did not want the Irish moving in. They did not want the Germans moving in. They were anti-Catholic. They were pro-Protestant. Has anybody ever heard of or seen the film Gangs of New York? That is what that film is based upon, all right? The nativist movement, the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. They actually do win some seats in Congress. They're more effective, though, in city politics. They're strongholder in places like New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. They got a presence in Boston. And they have legit gangs, okay? They have nativist gangs that don't mess around. And they control blocks, and they control crime and syndicated activity. So we'll talk a bit more about the gangs of New York later. One of my favorite nativist gang names comes actually from Baltimore. Their nickname was the Pug Uglies. So, anybody ever heard of this guy, William Poole, Bill the Butcher? Okay, this is the character, Daniel Day-Lewis in Gangs of New York. That's who he's based off of. All right, hang in there with me. You guys are doing great. Martin Van Buren, poor guy, also known as Martin Van Ruin for the Panic of 1837. Even though it wasn't his fault, it happened on his watch. He was consumed by this economic depression where unemployment rose to nearly 10%. The reason we do this, anybody do this? Okay. Just me, some of us? That is, okay. Guys, I wasn't trying to get that. So, the reason we do okay is because of Martin Van Buren. He was from Old Kinderhook, New York. He and his crew, they did that. Do I have any Seinfeld fans out there? Don't anybody watches that anymore? There's a really funny episode about the Van Buren boys. Stupid history joke, but it's funny. So, Van Buren and the Old Kinderhook boys from Old Kinderhook, he's our first American-born president. He's stifled by this bank failure, the bank collapse, the unemployment, the Panic of 1837, and living in the shadow of Jackson. He is going to be defeated in a landslide. There's another great cartoon the Whigs put out, shows Van Buren riding Andrew Jackson's back into Washington. Pretty funny.
What was Jackson's party again?
Jackson's Democrat. He drops the Republican, flat out Democrats. In fact, the reason that we have the donkey as the Democratic symbol is because they called Andrew Jackson's party the Andrew Jackasses. And they put the donkey in all these cartoons. He thought it was hilarious. So they kept the donkey as their mascot. Position of strength, the early 1900s, people used the elephant as that symbol of strength and power, and the Republicans ended up adopting it at the turn of the 20th century. So, yeah. So, William Henry Harrison. So we know about William Henry Harrison's war record. He served in the Western Indian Wars. He's the hero of Tippecanoe. His campaign slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. He war hero of the War of 1812, had served as governor out in Indiana Territory. served as governor of Ohio. It's kind of interesting. They run him on a really weird campaign platform. They run him as this like hard drinking, hard fighting guy that was born in a log cabin. Well, he was hard fighting, not really hard drinking, certainly not born in a log cabin. He was actually born at Berkeley Plantation down on Route 5. His family, they were some of the first families in Virginia. He studied medicine at Hampton Sydney. He came from some pretty significant wealth and prestige. He's also sort of portrayed in the media in this mudslinging campaign as like being a granny general, being an old man, being a granny president, not being, up to the task. So sort of like out of vain and pride, he gives a 2.5-hour inauguration address in the freezing cold rain, catches pneumonia, and dies a month later in office. So that's the demise of William Henry Harrison and his election. Check out this electoral landslide, though. This is 80% of the electoral vote. Pretty incredible. To date, this is the largest landslide to date. So his accidency will be notified. He's playing with his children, which is not out of the question for him. He had 15, more than any other president. He was married twice. His first wife passed away. He too is a Virginian. He's born to plantation aristocracy. He was born in Virginia, right down Route 5, not far from William Henry Harrison. He abandons the Whig policy. He doesn't recharter the bank. He doesn't do anything to adjust the tariff. His entire cabinet resigns, with the exception of Daniel Webster, who was Secretary of State. Really, his two crowning achievements are going to be essentially some foreign policy issues. He draws up a treaty to draw the formal border along Canada, Maine, and the Canadian border all the way to Minnesota over an event called the Aroostook War. It's a war fought between lumberjacks. It's also called the Pork and Beans War, fighting over lumberjack rights, logging rights between lumberjacks. And then he starts the process of the annexation of Texas. Polk. James K. Polk is a person that we would refer to as probably the first, what we would consider dark horse candidate. Okay? So North Carolina, he went to UNC, one of the oldest state colleges in the country. He goes to Tennessee, self-made in politics. Why would we call him a dark horse candidate? That's a good guess, but that's not what I'm looking for. It's because the candidates before that we've talked about had national prominence. No one knows who this guy really is. He's not been on any major national political stage. And he's going to come in here and win this election. A lot of it comes down to the fact that he says he's got, a pointed plan, and he's going to hit these points, and he actually achieves them. And he does it in one term. And to go off of what Warren just brought up, some of it actually was shaky, right? So the legacy of James K. Polk is a very controversial legacy. Many historians look at Polk and say, this man is one of the only presidents to ever come to the office and say, I'm going to get all this done, and actually got it done. But the way in which he did it was a little interesting. So, Texas is brought in as a slave state. The Oregon Territory dispute is settled. The Mexican War occurs on his watch, and the California Gold Rush begins as he leaves office. Democratic candidate who, poor old Henry Clay, just can't manage to get into the White House. I guess because he's like on that national stage. So Polk's legacy, a 4-point mission, lower the tariff to 25%, restore the independent treasury, clear up the Oregon border issue with England, which was an issue hanging around since the War of 1812, gain California in the Mexican cession as a result of the Mexican War, which was beyond messed up how this all went down, through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And again, really, all of this comes to fruition. Polk, considered one of the hardest working presidents in this era, worked 12 to 18-hour days, had gas lamps installed in the White House. Historians say the man worked himself to death. He died 3 months after leaving office. So let's hit the map here. We're going to talk about Texas as its own little republic in our next lesson, because Texas is actually going to come in and become its own country. They are going to fight against Mexico, gain independence, and then they enter as a slave state in 1845. So I'm like, all heads up, and I'll get to your question in a second. All heads up, pay attention, let's take a look at the map for a second. Florida, we purchased from Spain for $5 million. Louisiana Territory, purchased from France for $15 million. Texas, a little trickier. A group of Americans, mostly Southern, a lot of Virginian, are going to work out a treaty deal with Mexico to come down here and settle in this area. They don't really follow any Mexican law. Mexico wants them out. They fight Mexico for the land. They win this 6-month revolution. They become their own country for a little while. I'm going to bring that back to this, and I'll get to your question in a second. The Oregon Territory, technically all of the Oregon Territory all the way up to the border of Alaska was up for dispute. Polk wants all of it. Britain doesn't want to give it all up. But America nor Britain want to fight a war 3,000 miles away from D.C. and 6,000 miles away from London. So they're going to work out a treaty that's going to give the United States, Washington, Oregon, part of Montana, Idaho, part of Wyoming, and it will give Vancouver and this area, British Columbia, get it? British Columbia, Columbia River Valley, to England, right? So, the Mexican cession, this is where things get shady. The United States offers to buy California. Mexico says no. So Polk and the United States Army sent troops down into what is called the disputed territory. The United States is claiming all of this, Mexico is claiming all of this, and newspapers write back, send back via telegraph, Mexico has invaded the United States. That didn't happen, right? So this disputed war leads to soldiers being sent in. Fighting occurs down in Mexico City, Buena Vista, Chapultepec, Guadalupe, Santa Fe, Monterey, California. We're going to take a look at those battles later, okay? Break all those down. So, out of all that, Guadalupe, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, all of this land falls into the hands of the United States with a payment of like $28 million. So, in the end, if we don't get it through a treaty or we don't buy it, we outright take it. That's how Manifest Destiny occurred. And that's why we still have a very interesting, sort of like, you know, we kind of butt heads with Mexico a lot, but Mexico says, you guys tend to forget this land was practically stolen from the United States. Remember that. Keep that in mind. So I think it's important that we do keep that in mind, because even though this seems like a long time ago, 1848, you know, it's not that long ago. Question.
Like, when the U.S. takes territory like that, like, what happens to the people that live there? Do they become...
Yeah, I mean, they've essentially become sometimes citizens of the U.S., depends on the era, right? Before there were any civil rights, Native Americans, Latin Americans, Hawaiian, indigenous Alaskan Inuit people, their rights were ignored. You know what I mean? So white Americans that moved into those locations had rights. But there's a large group of people, it took them another 125 years in some cases, 100 in some cases, 125, 30, whenever to actually get those rights. Somebody last night said, what about like military coup d'etat, right? We want it for sugar, fruit, coffee, fuel depot, Midway Trade Depot in the Pacific. So we go in there and take it, right? Crazy, you know? So we'll talk about that as we move forward. So that was a little bit of a map breakdown. Now we're moving into what we would call the lame ducks. So I really appreciate you all hanging in there with me. I know that we're grinding it out today. Zachary Taylor, old Rough and Ready, is a military hero from the Mexican War, and he's Virginia-born, Louisiana plantation owner. He does a really brilliant thing in this campaign. He doesn't deal with any controversial issues. Slave state, free state balance, the issue of popular sovereignty, whether people should be able to choose whether they want slavery in a territory or not, the issue of the Mexican cession, all these hot button issues. Zachary Taylor just kind of leaves it alone. He just kind of runs on his celebrity, and it works. He's elected. He comes in there, and he just completely aggravates the Whigs all over again. This Whig president is not following through with Whig policy like they had anticipated. And what this is all about is he turns down what is known as the Compromise of 1850. This is a 5-part compromise. California enters as a free state. Popular sovereignty would be allowed in New Mexico and Utah territories. That means that people would be able to vote whether they wanted slavery or not. That means white males, right? The third thing, the formal border between New Mexico and Texas would be drawn up. Fourth thing, the slave trade, but not slavery, would be banned in Washington, D.C. But this is the most controversial, racist, and real tragic thing about it is the Fugitive Slave Act. That was attached to this, meaning that slaves and even free African Americans could be returned by bounty hunters to the American South. And what made it even more racist and messed up, judges made more money to actually send these slaves and free African Americans that lost their paperwork back into slavery in the South than they received for allowing them to go free. It was really messed up, really tragic, and again, much like the Trail of Tears, one of those moments in American history that's just horrible, shameful, and very tragic. Zachary Taylor comes down with cholera in office. You know what cholera is? It's like a bacterial infection. Dies in office. Millard Fillmore comes into power. Millard Fillmore, bit of a puppet of the party, so to speak, kind of goes with what they want, and will ultimately sign the Compromise of 1850 into law. He does not veto it like Taylor did, and that's the beginning and the end of his political career. Millard Fillmore was never really taken that serious. He these guys kind of rank down toward the bottom of the list of American presidents. They're considered some of the lamest of the ducks. So, Zachary Taylor defeated Lewis Cass of Michigan. Lewis Cass, he's the guy that popularizes the term popular sovereignty. He makes it a term that was used in political platform, meaning that people would have the choice to vote for slavery in a territory, a new territory. And then we have a new emergence of a new party, the Free Soil Party. They're going to run Martin Van Buren, and the Free Soil Party is our first political party that just outright is the abolitionist party. They want to see the freedom of slaves, or at least they want to make sure that all new territory does not become slave territory. The last thing we're going to talk about in terms of the map Gadsden Purchase. This is going to be the crowning achievement of Franklin Pierce. Pierce, one of our other lame ducks, again, just sort of like on the other side of it, he kind of becomes a bit of a puppet of the Democratic Party, as Fillmore was a puppet of the Whig Party. Fillmore's kind of ruled by Stephen Douglas. He's pushed into signing the Kansas and Nebraska Act, which leads to, over the issue of popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska, which leads to brutal, bloody fighting in a border war on the Kansas and Missouri border. He also loses a child in office, and he falls into a really, really deep depression. Once he leaves political office, he gets out of the public eye and kind of fades into obscurity. He is well known for the Gadsden Purchase, that land purchase out here for a railroad line to connect the area of Texas to California. However, there's another thing that unravels his term in office, and it's called the Ostend Manifesto. This is the idea that America would buy Cuba. Okay? So if Cuba was to be purchased, what would happen with Cuba? This is a really great question, and one that I think should be posed leading up to the Civil War. What would happen to Cuba if it was purchased? It wasn't for sale. Spain was not interested. And there was actually a little military revolt to attempt to overthrow it. Didn't work out. Any ideas? If the United States would have bought Cuba at this period of time, yeah. Not, well, maybe. It's a good point. Could be right. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah. Exactly. If Cuba would have been purchased, it would have likely become a slave state. Overnight, Cuba would have become the largest slave state in the South. And it wasn't just Spain that didn't want this. This is like division between North and South over the fact that the South is lobbying to try to bring Cuba in. Pierce and William Rufus King defeat Winfield Scott. Poor Winfield Scott. He was getting up there in age. Couldn't mount a horse anymore. Gotten a little bit out of shape. And the mudslinging in the campaign, they said, Winfield Scott can't run for office because he's never run for anything. Super messed up. So a lot of mudslinging in these days. Pretty messed up. Poor old Winfield Scott, old fuss and feathers. Military hero of the Mexican War and the War of 1812. All right, so Manifest Destiny has now been achieved. Talk more about that in our next lesson. And this is where we wrap up. James Buchanan, the last of the lame ducks, Democrat from Pennsylvania. He's a Southern states' rights advocate. He does have to deal with the Mormon War. There's a short-lived war in which the Mormon militia rose up against federal authorities in Utah. The Mormon faith starts in the 1830s, picks up a lot of followers and membership into the 1840s. Their leader, Joseph Smith, will be killed by a mob in Missouri, and their prophet, Brigham Young, will lead the Mormon people out to Utah. The Mormons had some things going against them that the federal government was leery of. Number one, they voted in a block, B-L-O-C. You know what that means? This means that if one, Brigham Young said, this is how we're voting, that's how everybody voted. right, to vote in a block. They were also at this period of time practicing polygamy, meaning they were taking multiple wives, which the federal government wanted that changed. Another thing that the Mormons had going against them is they had a militia force, and that militia force had entangling alliances with Native American tribes in the West. So there were a lot of different factors that led the federal government against the Mormons. Not to mention the religious factor as well, that most of the Protestants didn't see the Mormons' faith as one that they wanted to protect, which is a little ironic because what protects the Mormons' faith? Freedom of religion. Very good. First Amendment, right? Buchanan had little response to the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was an African-American slave who went to the courts to gain his freedom and lost. Little reaction to the John Brown raid and the execution of John Brown at the hands of Governor Wise of Virginia. Constant infighting and division with Democratic Party leader Stephen Douglas, which ultimately leads the party to divide into northern and southern. And then did very little following the secession of South Carolina after the election of Abraham Lincoln. So here we have Buchanan on the bottom there, John Brown, and there's the firehouse at Harper's Ferry. I'll teach you more about that event moving forward. And then we have the election results. Buchanan and Kentuckian John C. Breckinridge defeat the Pathfinder, John C. Fremont, and former President Millard Fillmore. You guys have any questions for me?